Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for our last kind of presentation of this series on transforming science teaching planning for the post-COVID new normal. Today we have Dr. Lori Andersen, who will be sharing some things around developing place-based agricultural science distance learning materials. And I'm super excited to hear about it and see how these things evolve and also think about where they are going. I want to thank the UCI Teacher Academy for supporting this series, as well as the UCI CalTeach program, of which I am the director of and also teach in. I want to start with a land acknowledgement. And today's session is taking place virtually. We're in lots of different places. I come to you from very close to the campus of UC Irvine, located in the traditional homelands of the Hachiman and Tongva peoples, where I am an uninvited guest. The Hachiman and Tongva continue to act as stewards on their ancestral lands, as they have for thousands of years in the face of ongoing settler colonialism. Both Hachiman and Tongva nations continue to claim their place in their traditional territory, would like to honor and respect the diverse Native and Indigenous peoples connected to this territory on which we virtually gather in. All right, and just in looking ahead, and I dropped the link in the chat for where you can find the prior sessions as well as this next session. In our final session of this series, we will bring all of our presenters back together to kind of have a conversation around what instruction will look like in the fall and thinking about things that we might do then. And again, I dropped that link in the chat. And with that, I will introduce, let me close the construction going outside that hopefully is not disruptive. I'll introduce Lori Andersen, who is an assistant specialist in the curriculum research and development group in the College of Education at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. Her research in science education, she conducts research in science education with an emphasis on three-dimensional place-based and problem-based learning. One of her current projects is development of a year-long 5th grade science curriculum that is place-based. She's also the principal investigator of the FEAST project, which is food experiences for agricultural science training, in which she designed and developed home-based distance learning materials for agricultural science teaching in grades 3 through 8 in collaboration with 10 teachers in Hawaii and Guam and an eco-literacy educator. The FEAST project will distribute 21,000 learning kits to teachers and their students throughout Hawaii and Guam, funded by the USDA. Dr. Andersen began her educational career as a high school science teacher before completing a doctorate in education policy, planning, and leadership at William and Mary, with an emphasis on gifted education and science education. Dr. Andersen's science teaching has been recognized by multiple national level awards, and she's a national board certified teacher. Her previous professional experiences include developing large-scale science assessments and teaching elementary science methods. All right, so without further ado, I will turn it over to you, Lori. We're so glad to have you.
Well, thanks, Doron. That was a lot of words. And when I hear all that, I'm always like, did I really do all those things? You know, it sounds like it's somebody else. So I'm happy to come and talk to your group here. This is a really exciting project you've put together to hear about all these different things happening in education. So let me see if I can share. Normally I have 2 screens. So if something happens and I can't see the chat, please clue me in if there's something in the chat I need to see, because I'm on one little screen. Normally I have a side monitor. So let me share and oops, not that. Let's try present. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today about our feast project, which has been a real whirlwind. You'll see when we get later in the thing what our timeline is like. This project was only an idea last summer, and it was a grant proposal which got funded and then just became quite the whirlwind. So before we get started, I kind of wanted to orient you to the problem that we wanted to address with this project. I am in Hawaii, and it's a different context than being on the continental United States. And so I wanted to think about, why is growing food locally important for Hawaii? And if you could think about that for a minute. I mean, we only have a few people, so if anyone wants to share their thoughts or put it in the chat. Why is it different here? Well, it looks like I can get the chat window up. I think I can kind of see everything. Expensive to import, I see Lisa put in, definitely. Do you have any idea what percentage of our food here is from imports? Actually, about 90% of our food is imported in Hawaii. I see Doron put in self-sustainability challenges and issues is definitely an issue. So it's different being on a remote island out in the Pacific. We are a couple thousand miles away from the nearest land mass, but we have a lot of people here. We have 1.5 million people in Hawaii. So it does cost a lot to transport food. Elisa says, and I agree. It definitely is expensive to get our food here. Everything costs more in Hawaii because we're paying that shipping cost, and yet the average income here is not higher than what it is other places. In some fields, the average income is lower here than other places. So people that are here have a higher burden for the cost of living, yet they don't earn more money. So to kind of just set the setting of what's happening here. So you put this situation where we already have issues with our local food system and getting food here, and then COVID happens. Right, so how do you think COVID-19 impacted our local food system? And again, I mean, there's only a few of us here. You're welcome to chime in or put in the chat, whatever you're more comfortable with.
Thinking it must have upped the prices, because it's even in California, it's really hard to not get food so much, but other items, right? Like, so it just seems like the chain, like the harbors are backed up here. So I'm wondering if you have the same issue,
Yeah, they were definitely worried about disruptions to shipping. There were definitely certain products that were hard to get. Remember the toilet paper and hand sanitizer thing? Lisa wrote fear of imported goods. I think in the beginning, remember when we were all wiping our packages down and all that jazz at the beginning of COVID? Also, there were some apologize for the announcements. I'm in an airport.
Wow, you're doing this presentation from an airport. You're really awesome.
Oh, this is a long announcement, apparently.
Log on to the site, travel.hawaii.gov, and scan the QR code to create an account and profile. This will significantly help to expedite the quarantine check-in.
Oh my, maybe I'll just try and go on anyway. So local food systems were really impacted because think about what the local food system does, right? There is agriculture on Hawaii, but who were their primary customers? Where did the food go? What's the primary industry in Hawaii? Tourism, right? So these growers were growing things and selling them to restaurants and hotels. And then when COVID happened, what happened to restaurants and hotels? They shut it all down. So where could the food go? Did they have a mechanism to get it there? I mean, there was a lot of problems with the food system because of that disruption. I mean, all the farmers markets closed down, the restaurants closed down, and they had all this food. I remember seeing articles in the news about farmers burying crops and, you know, things that happened at the beginning of COVID just because the food system got so disrupted. So all these things kind of set the context for this grant proposal that we wrote. And Dora wrote about the farming for food versus cash crops. Yeah, a lot of people were bartering. When COVID started, people started trading with their neighbors and doing things that they hadn't done before because of all of the supply chain disruptions. So this is kind of a little bit of summary about our context. Like I mentioned, we are one of the most geographically isolated population centers. 90% of our food is imported. On the average, we have about a 5 to 7 day food supply on island. So that means, you know, if our shipping system breaks down, we only have food for a week. It's kind of a problem. Food insecurity, there's something like 48% of families are considered food insecure here. And we also have that the indigenous food system knowledge has been lost. The effects of colonization and tearing out what used to be local agriculture and building hotels. So this is a interesting place to be in that because of all this change that's occurred over history, both long-term history and recent history. So to give you a little bit more about food system, just because I really think that although the curriculum materials we developed don't really address this with elementary school students, it's important to understand why is it important to teach agricultural science ideas to kids. Our food system is a big factor in our health. And you can see in this infographic, the social determinants of health. You can see in the bottom, there are racial and ethnic factors involved in health, how much access do you have to healthy food, the environment, your socioeconomic status. And all of these things affect people's, the impact on people of chronic diseases and of things like diabetes and high blood pressure and obesity, and also ended up impacting the relative effect of COVID on people from different groups. For example, Pacific Islanders and Native Hawaiians were much more impacted by COVID than other groups comparatively. In Hawaii, we have 175 school learning gardens because there's been a big impetus by our local organizations to develop these school learning gardens. And so the school learning garden teachers were like, well, how am I going to teach kids school learning garden when we're all remote? So, but there weren't any really distance learning materials. Anything that was available online that might have been available from a different source generally wasn't culturally relevant because like you can, oh, Lisa has a lot of gardens in her district too. That's good to hear. So generally, if you could download curriculum, say from, you know, Wisconsin or even from California, it's going to be different, right? Different climates, different plants, all the things are different. So we wanted something that was going to be relevant to this place. And so we needed to develop our own materials. Oops. So the goals of our proposal, so we wrote the proposal in August and we got funded to start in November. It was very rapid turnaround, was to develop a PD course for teachers to help them develop distance learning materials, and then to produce the distance learning materials, and then provide access to those materials to teachers throughout Hawaii and Guam. And also we have built in an iteration cycle so we can gather feedback and revise in response to feedback from use. So here's our timeline. It was pretty short. In December of last year, we solicited applications from teachers.
Mandate requires the use of a face mask at all airports, on all commercial flights, and on all public transportation. Thank you for your cooperation.
So we found 10 teachers that wanted to write for us, and we did PD. It was all online. I never met any of them because it was COVID times, right? So we were doing it all with Zoom and Google Classroom and people that I had not really met before. And we worked over the Christmas break because that was when teachers were going to have time because they were busy trying to teach remotely and do all the things that other teachers were doing. And so we developed these 2 books, one for grade 3-5 and one for grade 6-8. And we did all of that over that winter break. Now here we are in May, and we are distributing 15,000 learning kits, which is the first round, which are just being received by the islands this week. And then we'll have our evaluation cycle and our revision cycle in the fall. To give you a little bit of background as to what went into the design of the materials, we went and looked at the literature about distance learning, but with the caveat that a lot of our students who were in these food insecure homes, high poverty homes, rural areas, didn't have good internet access. So whatever we needed to do, it needed to be accessible to students who didn't have internet, which, you know, when people think distance learning, they're thinking distance learning is all about Zoom, right? And Google Classroom and being online. Well, no, we weren't going to do that. We needed something that could be hard copy in their hands, that they could be home doing with their family, that were still going to enable them to do some, you know, some high quality learning. So we looked at some frameworks. This essential, desirable, optional framework, and actually talks about how you can use distance learning with people who don't have internet access. And it was actually research that came from use in prison populations, which is kind of bizarre, but anyway, when they were delivering distance learning to people in prison can't get on the internet. So they had this framework to think about how to decide what content was the most important and what needed to be the most accessible. So we used that idea. We also looked at, isn't that interesting that it came from prison? Now, the model of interactions talks about, you know, when we teach in the classroom, we expect students to be able to turn and talk to their partner, to have discussions with the teacher. And in Zoom, we can do that too. But if your students are at home and they're with a grandparent or an aunt or an uncle or, you know, whoever, right, they need a way to have those interactions so that they can have this deep and meaningful learning. So we had to come up with ways to replace those classroom interactions by using community members and friends and family. So we had to be a little creative about how to do that. The thing in the bottom left corner, noticing and sense making and modeling, is my small contribution. It's just a way that I use to think about the cross-cutting concepts in 3 general categories. I have, we look at the noticing group, which are the things that we look at to see what's happening in a phenomena, which is your patterns, scale, and stability and change. And then sense making is how do we figure out why it's happening, cause and effect, and energy and matter, and structure and function, and then modeling about and how do we communicate how it's happening. And the last thing, which was kind of unique to this project, was the Hawaii School Garden Curriculum Map, which was a scope and sequence that was put together on the Big Island by educators to sequence what they thought was important for students to learn in terms of the school garden and for raising their own food. So they had 4 themes and they had learning outcomes. So we really built the activities around those learning outcomes and then looked at ways that we could fit the NGSS dimensions in with that rather than driving it the other way. So the NGSS dimensions did not drive the kind of the outcomes, more so the garden map did, and we integrated the NGSS. So for the cross-cutting concepts, this kind of gives a little more detail on that noticing, sense making, and modeling that I was talking about. This came from some research.
Rooms are located on the lobby level and on the 2nd floor next to gates 4, 6, and 8.
In 2019, they came up with this idea that the cross-cutting concepts really have first and second order groupings. And the first order concepts were patterns and cause and effect. And then the second order are the blue ones underneath, which was a different way to think about it, which inspired this noticing, sense making, and modeling. And then systems and system models kind of encompasses everything because it combines the what and the why as you explain how something happens. So it's just a different way to look at it. That YouTube link, if you had a few minutes to spare, that's something that we produced at CRDG if you were interested in watching that. I also thought about the cross-cutting concepts as a learning sequence, because you think about like the 5E model, like your engage, explore, explain, elaborate, evaluate. I said, okay, well, noticing, that's kind of like engage and explore, right? What's around us? How do we, figure out what the phenomena is? And then our sense making is like the explain, right? So sense making comes in the middle and we have to figure out why it's happening. And then the modeling is the way that we express our understanding. So I look at that as being a way to sequence the cross-cutting concepts in learning. So here's a picture of our feast kits. And so every child got a workbook, and they got a little package of colored pencils and seeds that were local seeds, thermometer, a pipette, a measuring tape, and a magnifying lens. So they got all this stuff ready to go so they could do science at home. We were very excited to get all this stuff in the hands of the kids. This gives you an idea of what's in a book. The teachers decided what the sequence would be. They looked at the Hawaii School Garden curriculum map, and we were thinking about, what's the outcome we want here? We really want students to know about their local food system, and what are the things that we can do to take care of our place and to raise food. So you can see that these lessons are a little bit different than maybe a Western-oriented science perspective. Western or science is usually about what happens and why it happens and how it happens, but a lot of this is what should you do, right? Which is something we don't always talk about in science. A lot of times we say science is neutral, or, but in Indigenous science, a lot of things are about what should you do? How should I act in my place to fulfill my responsibilities and maintain my relationships with the place? I have an example of a lesson here that
Just when she was getting to the exciting lesson part. I'm sure she'll rejoin us in a second.
anything that they'd like to know more than what I've already talked about. So the next section was really an example from the book.
Did
Go
the
ahead, Lisa.
teachers have any issues with their schools or their school districts sort of using these more sort of Indigenous views on science, well, agriculture, science, etc., rather than the more traditional curriculum? Well, traditional curriculum.
That's a good question. The teachers that participated had prior PD in a program called Ku'ainapa, and had prior involvement in the school learning gardens, so that there'd been some groundwork laid for that kind of an orientation. It'll be interesting to see what other teachers do with that as these materials go out and a wider group of teachers start using them. I would say that we don't really emphasize, we don't talk about Western versus non-Western in the book. It just is more of a tone that comes out, because I don't know about you, but I never read a school science book that asked me, what should I do? It was more like, how does this work? And this idea of my responsibility was to the environment was never a big emphasis as it is here. So, but that is an interesting question. We are surveying the teachers after they get the materials and use them. There's a teacher survey, and we will be collecting work samples of student work as we go into our evaluation cycle. And it'll be interesting to hear what people have to say. I would say that this environment is more receptive to that because the school district, the DOE, has what they call a HA framework, HA, and it is about encouraging Native Hawaiian values and perspectives into the curriculum across all content areas. So that is definitely more of an emphasis here.
All areas within the terminal building are designated as smoke-free. Thank you for your cooperation.
Thank you for your patience with all of these crazy announcements. Were there any other questions or comments?
One item and one personal item, such as the first 3 case or
So the next section is an example from the grade 3 to 5 book. And I think Doron shared the link where you could download your own copy of the books if you like. The PDFs are free. So there are free resources. There's also a teacher guide and a family guide that's on the website. So you're more than welcome to use those. In fact, it would be fantastic if other people looked at them and gave feedback on them so that we can, continue to improve this work. This lesson that, I'm probably not sharing my screen anymore if I need to do that. Okay. Okay. Not enough screen, too many buttons. Okay, so this is a lesson out of the elementary book on the parts of the plant. And you've probably seen lessons about the parts of the plant before. What we tried to do differently here was to emphasize the NGSS ideas of systems and parts that work together, and also to make connections to their context as far as where they live and the kind of plants around them. So you'll notice in the lesson we have the students looking for plants around their home and to name them. We also want them to find out how they use the plants and why they're important. So talking to their family and friends. Then we get into doing some other noticing activities, looking at similarities and differences in patterns. So the students can sort the plants and decide what they want to sort them by, so we can find out what they know about patterns. Then we kind of go into some more content about shapes and jobs. We made a real point of picking plants that actually are plants they would see where they live. So you can see we have a taro plant, we have a tropical leaf, we have the papaya. So we made sure that we picked the plants that they would be familiar with. There are some links to some videos with QR codes, but those were more supplementary to the book than actually required to develop the learning. We wanted, again, with our essential, desirable, optional framework, we wanted to make sure that they could get all the knowledge they needed to do the activities from what was available on paper. And then they have to put it all together and describe how the plant parts work together as a system, developing a model. And so we would be looking for them to show how the plant takes in materials and moves it around using the roots and the stems and the leaves. And that is the last slide. So now, for those of you that have school gardens, what kind of curricula do you use? I'd be kind of curious to find that out.
So this is our second year of the last next gen science adoption. And there are some great taking FASA outdoors examples that can be done in the garden, whether it's like examining worms. Most of our gardens do have a vermicomposting thing. But there's the disconnect in that lots of our gardens are run by volunteers, right? So you have parent volunteers that aren't teachers and they're running the garden and they'll look up anything on the internet, right? For a garden activity. And if I'm in contact with those volunteers, then I can give them like a special login to FAS, but think of all that they'd have to learn, right? So, and then we had COVID, right? In March of our first year of the adoption. And so usually the life science things would just be in the spring, right? And suddenly it was the first year of the adoption. So this year though, we actually used lots of the techniques that you said for interactions on Zoom. We started the year on Zoom or Google Meet, and then we ended up being in person in September. And at first people were nervous in the garden. You think they would have been natural, right? Oh, you got a garden, you got tables, you got umbrellas, you're spread apart, it's COVID. But instead, I think they were nervous about surfaces and this sort of bias that kids will be close to each other in an outdoor space, right? Like I can't control them, right? So when I am able to talk to the volunteers and the teachers, and someone collaborates and says, hey, you can use this TE and set up these seeds, or we're looking at seed dispersal, it's great. But something you alluded to at the beginning is, I think there's this disconnect. It'll be like garden science. We're looking at plant leaves, but not this social justice or food justice or any of the connection between food is in the garden. When I was in the classroom, I got to do a lot of that at our school garden. We've had a garden for 24 years, right? We could plant, and then we could make salad, and we could taste, and we could talk all about that. But it is definitely an issue. So I even like the name of your program, Feast, because it automatically connects it to food that you eat, you know? But we have a lot of room to grow. And I always think that the more of us that talk to each other, the better, because there's just so much research about even, I read this great article in Sun magazine about how a lot of people who were Black didn't want to garden, right? Because they already have such a history of being discriminated against, right? In terms of working the land, right? But if you're impoverished and you can make your own food, it's so much better, like you said, with all the research. So it's, you know, we have a lot of Hispanic scholars in our district, and I like teaching students about found gardens, right? And that you can just make a garden in a tire, and kids feel empowered when they grow things, but yeah, it's hard.
We do have a garden design lesson in the book that is about, you know, using what you have around you. And so
that's good. So they can make it at home. And I also saw you have family guides, it looks like, right?
Yeah, we have a family guide, so that it's just a one pager for the parents, because they might be the facilitator, right? That's what our concern was, is that we were in the middle of COVID. I mean, it's kind of, because it took so long, we really wanted to distribute these materials sooner, but because some of the trouble points, which I guess maybe I should have shared, when you're at a university and you want to procure things, it's complicated. So to procure 21,000 thermometers and 21,000 this took a lot of paperwork and time, and then the time for printing and the time for editing. So we're just now getting the materials out. So that's like a 5-month process.
Right.
And now the kids will be face to face in the fall.
So Lori, I wonder about two things that you kind of touched on. First, this is spectacular. And as a secondary person, I'm kind of looking at this and trying to think also how this would fit, you know, at the secondary level. But, and this is a little bit to your point also, Lisa, you know, in Southern California, we have a lot of food deserts, and in many ways it's very urban. And one of the things that I wonder about is, you know, how do we bring this in, and how do we connect to the land, which in many ways has been, you know, colonized to such a point where it doesn't, you know, it literally doesn't exist in the same format as it did before. So that's one question. And my other question, I think your approach is just wonderful and amazing. And I wonder if you are thinking of producing anything at kind of at that level that would allow, similar to what you said, right? If somebody lives in Wisconsin, a papaya tree may not be the thing that connects to them. Are you thinking of potentially doing something where it's a little bit at a higher level, capturing your approach that then other people can take on and kind of create their own lessons? You muted yourself.
I just muted myself. That's a really interesting question, because this was never really a research project. This was an emergency rapid response to COVID project. But there are some interesting research questions, I think, because this idea of angling distance learning to low tech is kind of not something people are pursuing, and then, you know, making it place-based. So I think there are directions it could go. I think a lot of that depends on what happens next in education. But there are more like garden learning materials that are already available, say through other projects, that are more appropriate for the continent. I'm not sure. Most of the things that I looked at, though, were a very different approach as far as being more about rote knowledge versus modeling and being much less cognitively deep. You know, that was my big complaint about the materials I saw. It was like, let's do a crossword puzzle with the parts of the plant and, you know, let's color in a picture. So I think using the garden as a context for three-dimensional teaching and learning has a lot of potential. And Megan Bang is doing some of that in her work in the K2 Learning in Places program. So
I literally was looking at her stuff as you were talking, and literally that seems to be the only thing I can even think of that remotely is similar to what you're doing. Everything else is very much kind of, you know, like Elisa said, right? It's rote, it's like, or it's very like county, like how many bean sprouts do we have, right?
yeah, well, I think like Elisa said also is a lot of times your garden learning person isn't a certified teacher. A lot of times they are a you know, a different kind of employee. So this idea of using the garden to teach science, it needs to be explored. I mean, one of my things, especially at the elementary level, that kind of drives me crazy is we're pushing so many different content domains down there, and if we keep them all siloed, how are people ever going to get it all done? We just keep piling more content. Now we're adding computer science this year. They've got science, math, social studies, the garden, whatever. If we don't integrate, there's no hope.
No,
But yeah,
you're right. And then with COVID, we weren't allowed to have volunteers. So what happened is we had teachers who weren't as familiar with gardens as the volunteers. The volunteers weren't on campus. So at some Shining Star schools, the parents would contact me. I'd give them an idea. They'd set it up in the garden, like on the table. Then the teacher could bring their scholars in. But again, there's still that disconnect. And what you said is like, for me, it's so natural to integrate, but I realize as a science curriculum specialist that I'm the exception. You know, I majored in science, but I'm in the elementary space. That's unusual already. But one of my favorite years was when I taught second grade in 2014. I said, I'm going to do project-based learning in the garden. And so we interviewed the volunteer for the pests. What are the pests? And we said, okay, it has to be an organic solution. And I could have taught that the entire year. So there were like pill bug pests for eggplants. I mean, things I didn't even know about, right? Bunnies, and I learned that, you know, bunnies can jump 2 feet high. I mean, the kids found out all the things. So we had 9 pests, 32 scholars, you know, 3 or 4 scholars in a group. We had hand-me-down little computers, like ThinkPad, little rotten computers, but they just, you know, they just took it very seriously that she was their client. And they would be like, you can use cinnamon. And like you said, Lori, we could do math in the garden. We could take pictures in the garden. We could write about it in the garden. Kids that never wanted to write about one darn thing would write volumes about the garden. So I noticed looks like your curriculum has that kind of PBL approach, which I really like. But we need to unite all of us together somehow, you know.
yeah, that's been a struggle too. Like I know we have math educators at CRDG, and when I'm like, well, let's do integrated science and math, and they go, well, using math isn't teaching math, and so this whole kind of thing. I'm like, well, yeah, because I agree. I mean, we certainly could do a lot of things in the context of the garden, but maybe that's about reframing what we think we should be doing in the classroom. I mean, one of my ideas that I was playing around with was doing the whole 5th grade in the garden was one of my ideas. And then, I don't know, it wasn't that well received. I think I'm going to go back to it because I've been doing a lot more work with the School to Garden, Farm to School Network folks. And they're so passionate about what they do. And because food sustainability is so important, I mean, what are you without food, right? Not only do you need it to live, it becomes part of your body. I mean, it's responsible for your health. But we're not really teaching kids all that stuff. We're expecting them to learn it on their own.
And Lori, I think you bring up a really interesting point that, especially at the elementary level, we need to see that happen. because again, I'm thinking of it from a secondary perspective that's even more siloed, that we need some inspiration. We need to see it happen so we can push it upwards as well, because we desperately need it at the secondary level. Everything that you described, right, is also happening in middle schools and high schools, but really progressively worse.
Yeah, I think that's why I really like socioscientific issues kind of units and things that bring in, different content areas. But I don't think there's enough of that happening, because I think people are afraid that, oh, if I do this, I won't be able to cover all my content, right? And yeah, but that's why I really like what's been happening in some of the more problem-based curriculum that's been coming out, where it is more phenomena-based. And so I think the future is in that direction. So we just need to make it happen, Doron.
Well, I mean, I can tell you where I'm thinking, and maybe this goes a little bit to Lisa's point earlier, is I'm trying to find out of school settings where those constraints are removed, right? Because you all just described, right, everything that you hear from a teacher, and maybe it's out of school time settings. Maybe it's an after school thing or a summer thing or something else, where you don't have to, fight so many different systems that are really working against doing something like that.
Yeah, but when you start going out of school, then it's like, okay, which families are going to do that and which ones won't? And so in our, free and public education, what do we want people to learn? What are the life skills that we want people to take out of their K-12 education? And I think we need to reevaluate that. Now, I'd like people to come out of their K-12 education knowing how to live a healthy life. And I'm not sure we do that.
Yeah, and I
Makes me
mean, I have
think that-
seen, sorry, go ahead, Elisa.
I was thinking that a couple of things. One, I've been getting more preschool teachers on site into the garden, because I think that actually helps families realize things early. It's kind of like, you can't tell a 13-year-old to not text and drive. They're too close to being able to drive. You have to start younger, or smoking and all that. And I think, like, our high school students actually drove a campaign to get solar panels at all the parking lots. They drove the campaign. They found out about the grant through the state of California. So I think if we could get these like STEM ambassadors or garden ambassadors from high school, get the preschool in there too, and the teacher ed program, because then we'd be socializing our new teachers to this notion, right? Because it's a different notion. But this is really about equity too, right? Because what I'm always telling people is every scholar comes to school feeling empowered about nature and the environment. They know, like, if you're a poor kid, like I was a first generation kid, I knew a lot about dirt and worms and all this kind of crap because I walked to school, right? So I knew about ant behavior, because that's how that was my safe time, like the 1 hour it took me to walk to school, even at age 6, right? So then we take that away because we make it so non-practical, in science. It's like multiple choice tests. So if we realize that, then we honor the funds of knowledge that a scholar brings to the setting. And so we have to kind of socialize it. So I was thinking about your program and how you designed it in this distance learning environment. And there are some good things about that, in that I've done a lot of good distance learning PD through Canvas, whereas teachers that are so busy that wouldn't come to an in-person workshop. And an in-person workshop in the garden is so much fun. I love to do a leaf sort and put a mat out, and it's so cozy and wonderful. But if you capture them perhaps in a blended format, where they could do some of this learning, like from your program, an example, in a Canvas environment at home, and then come to the garden and you have, like a garden tea, or you make a salad together, or you look at leaves, or you have the worms out, then you make it like cozy, and then work with your informals like we have inside the outdoors. And so sometimes when I get pissed at my teachers or my schools, I think, I'm going to work with the Y. And then I feel inspired again, because the YMCA teachers, I'm thinking I could capture some of those teachers. They might want to become teachers, right? They're working, they need a job, it's $15 an hour. Some of them are natural teachers, And so if we support them, they might decide to go to Doran's program or whatever, right? And I think we just have to put our heads together and talk about food justice, and talk about, like, it's amazing, right? How much food you can, like, it doesn't take much to to feed just 2 of us, just my husband and me now that our kids are grown. And I'm doing this lesson on erosion now, wind erosion. And my husband, I was telling him about it, and he brought a great point. He goes, you know, when we see your sister in Port Hueneme, those low-lying fields, they all have trees in a row. I think that's a windbreak because the farmers need them. And much as I thought about erosion, like science teacher, science, I always think like arches or big things. I don't think about just something like that. So that's one of the reasons why I was intrigued to come today, because it even gets my brain thinking more about, and Earl found this thing like that a tree doesn't have to be that high to have a huge effect on wind erosion, right? So that's like physics, right? And I wasn't even thinking like that.
There is so much science that we haven't thought about in the garden. There's a lesson in the 6-8 book that's about leaf structure and function, and thinking about, you know, well, why is it that some leaves are thin and some leaves are thick? And we know the number of leaves on the tree, and, you know, what are the advantages, you know, why is it good to have a large number of leaves, but why don't you want, you know, there's a lot of things going on in there about dealing with thermal energy transfer and collecting solar energy and all these things that we don't really think about. So yeah, I think there's other things we could do in education to make it more relevant. And yeah, I mean, food sustainability is certainly relevant in California. I mean, you're not a remote island, but I mean, I was just reading about one town, there was an article in the New York Times today about one town that's sinking because they're drawing so much water out of the ground, and the town is sinking a lot, right? And a lot of that water usage is for agriculture, right?
And Lori, I think one of the things that both you and Elisa have brought up is the thing it seems that is being centered are the students' identities and kind of their funds of knowledge, but also these systemic issues. And then the science is used to make sense of it, right? Which in many ways, and the approach that you present is also very different than traditional science, but it really flips the whole thing on its head, right? Of, you know, what is relevant, like you just said, to these students, but also then bringing them into these systemic issues that they may or may not be aware of.
Yeah.
And then the science just kind of comes out of it, because just like you said, you need to understand these things in order to figure these things out.
Right. Now, I will give one caveat that I think that the level of like these NGSS lessons, oh, now they're going to have 2 announcements at once. The level of the NGSS is not as deep as the storyline lessons, which I think are like the gold standard. And we're just not there yet in Hawaii because we're early in NGSS implementation. Our teachers don't have the comfort level yet to be in storyline lessons. So these are not as deep of 3-dimensional integration as you would see in like those kinds of lessons. But it's a start, right? It's a place to start.
Well, and I think it also raises a point, and it is being recorded. You know, NGSS are a set of standards, but I forgot who said earlier, or maybe it was you, Lori, about, you know, you want students, nothing in the NGSS says that you should leave high school or school understanding, you know, how your body works, right? Or understanding how to be an ethical human in your food consumption, or be able to understand where your food comes from. And it isn't necessarily a knock on the NGSS, but it's just recognizing that the NGSS has some limitations, and that there are other things, ideas, perspectives, and even standards that can work along with that. And again, I really loved kind of your design approach, and kind of centering local communities as a keystone. I mean, who says that shouldn't be one of our standards?
Yeah, I mean, that's one thing I've discovered, especially focusing on the cross-cutting concepts, is the cross-cutting concepts really are Western, right? They are the thinking tools for Western science, but other cultures' science uses different thinking tools and different lenses. So like the lens of reciprocity or responsibility, or relationships are much more prominent in Native or Indigenous thinking. And so we tried to bring that out in here. And I mean, I'm an advocate for that. The cross-cutting concepts need to be expanded. I don't know if I'll ever get anywhere with that, but you know, I can keep trying.
I like some of the statistics you had, and I was wondering like a source for those. Like, I wish I knew that about, you know, California, like how many people grow their own food, what
Oh,
percentage is, how do you find that out?
well, at West Oahu, there's a professor who specializes in food sustainability work. So a lot of that data I've gotten from him, but there's also a lot of community organizations that are focusing on that. So it's kind of a widely known statistic. I would imagine to be much, much lower in California, considering all the agriculture you have there.
But I will say this about California. I've recently done some work with some rural schools. Is, you know, California is not a homogeneous place, and there is a fair bit of literature around urbanicity. And in California, how rural communities are basically exploited by suburban and urban communities. So we could ask, like, if you think about Orange County, San Diego, LA, right? You have tens of millions of people living in that area. How much of our own food is produced in those areas versus a place like the Imperial Valley, right? That basically exists to some degree to make our food. And I also think, I mean, I think there are larger, really super interesting things like people want apples year round. People want bananas. Well, where do bananas come from, right? And even like this nature of seasonal fruit and seasonal vegetables, of why do we eat things in particular places? I think even that piece can be unpacked in a lot of interesting ways. And again, I go back, Lori, I love kind of the overarching, because these overarching themes are going to exist, I think, exist in every setting.
Yeah, I would think a bigger problem in California might be like food deserts and access to grocery stores. Like like Doran said, if you're in an urban area, typically you have much harder time getting to a grocery store that sells like fresh produce. So I would think the statewide numbers could be very different than in certain communities, which is what we have here too. We have very remote rural communities that don't, and some of the teachers here locally have had like kids map out their local food system, like use like Google Maps and drop pins, like where can you buy groceries? Where's all this thing? And then you get a map of your local food system and you can see where's the gaps, you know, where are the people that have less access. And so I think the different imports might not be the big trouble in California as much as equity of access.
There's a lot of stuff around that in LA, right? And now we're also starting to see with COVID, the locations where people live in proximity to freeways and air quality, right? This, you know, it can go in a lot of different directions.
And that story map looks really cool. I haven't used that tool much myself, but I've seen what it can do. It's pretty powerful.
I think that it would be great to have a panel. You know, it makes me wonder, like, if any of the AP environmental science classes that are local, right? Because we have 6 high schools and 12 middle schools. I just wonder if any high school students are looking at these story maps or these issues, because when kids can talk, like I could imagine having a panel for teachers to hear about the issues, you know, to be motivated. Because it's so important. And in our district, we have 36 elementary schools, but we have some that are like 97% free or reduced lunch, and some that are like 2%, all in the same district, you know? So it's easy to look at the average and forget about the true story, you know?
Yeah, I mean, and here we have some unique issues because of the history of the area. Before colonization, there were big breadfruit orchards and, you know, lots of taro planting, and there was fish farming, and all that was torn down to put in hotels and develop housing. And a lot of that knowledge has even been lost. So when you think about that, that's also a big equity issue. So that's kind of unique to here, but I would imagine even in California, if you looked at some of the indigenous traditions and how much of that has been disrupted by development in California, probably quite a bit.
Orange County, our area has got, there are not many people studying it, but there is clear literature of the Santa Ana River Basin was destroyed and poisoned such that indigenous people really could not use it for tradition. I mean, it's almost like a terraforming what happened in Southern California. So it's definitely here too.
And here in Hawaii, we have high school, in the CTE program in high school, they have a food systems career pathway where they get into more of these kind of things, in 3-5. I mean, we don't have a real in-depth, like one of the activities, one of the lessons in the book, we have them look at a very common meal here, which is musubi. You guys know what musubi is? So musubi is like rice and spam and a piece of nori around it, right?
Oh, yeah.
Well, where does all that stuff come from, right? Where does spam come from? Where does nori come from? Well, spam comes from, I forget, I think it's like Minnesota or something. All the spam is made in Minnesota, and nori comes from Japan, and rice comes from, it could come from Japan. It also comes from like southeastern US or even from California, but none of it comes from here. So we have them engage in a musubi design contest to design a musubi that's better for their health and better for the planet. So I'm curious to see what the kids design. I'm really excited about that.
Other thoughts or questions that folks have? I know it's 5:03.
I guess it'll just be interesting to see. You'll distribute all the kits, and then it'll be interesting to see, like, are you going to have, like, do you have a Twitter presence? Are you going to have families take pictures, or,
right,
something like that?
We do have a Twitter handle. I think it's, let me get it now. I should know it, but I don't use it that much. It's at feast_2020.
Oh, good.
So yeah, we plan on putting out pictures and products that we did put QR codes in the book so students could share pictures with us. So we're hoping to see things that the kids do and, generate some interest.
That's something I did as a teacher. I wrote a grant called Voices in the Garden, because I used to see the parents standing around outside the classroom by the garden with their phones and yakking it up. And I had friends that would like cover their windows. And I said, we should turn the garden into a museum. So I put the QR codes on a painter stick, laminated, and they went to kids' voices. Now it could be anything, like a poem about strawberries, or it could be like, this is our radish. We planted it last week. It's already got some green stuff, and then you could, in a notebook, keep the QR codes seasonally, right? And you could replace them because the painter stick had like a sheath and you just stuck them in. And that way, when the parents were standing around, they could use their phone and walk around with their younger, children and listen to the voices in the garden. And it was very easy to do and super fun. And it made you just think, because kids, oh my gosh, I love kids in the garden. They just love the garden. And even for me, I never grew potatoes until I was a teacher. And it was like digging for gold, like a leprechaun. Like the potatoes never ended. Like I couldn't believe it. Like this little plant could have this many potatoes. So that's what I would capture on and then put on the QR code. So maybe your scholars, if they do something at home, they could do that, and not just pictures, but like even their voice about what they noticed or whatever.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, it's really, the creativity of the kids and the teachers. I mean, you can share so many things now. Of course, there's always rules, right? Because of privacy and things like that. A lot of teachers, you can't just have kids sharing their faces and things, but maybe their voice is okay.
Yeah, that's why I just did voice,
But thank you for the opportunity to come and talk with all of you. And it's been a lot of fun.
Thanks for coming, Lori. Appreciate your commitment, especially having to come from the airport. I know we set this up what feels like 6 months ago. Thank you all for coming as well. I'm really looking forward to our final session where Lori, who's here, and Wanda, who's here, along with a few of the other folks who have led prior sessions, will come together and we'll just have a conversation about thinking about fall, because I think what precipitated this back in November or December was really thinking about how we can support students as we come back into some new version of normal. And it seems like it's happening. And it also seems like a lot of the things that will be happening are not necessarily going to be the best for kids. So I think that will give us an opportunity to really have a little more of a conversation around that. And then potentially dig in deeper into some of those things over summer. So thank you all for coming, and thank you so much again, Lori, for presenting. It's super interesting.
Yeah, thank you.